Oh, yeah, right. I'm going to need to get you mic'd. All right, good evening. Welcome to a Black History of Electronic Dance Music, the lecture series at Harvard University, sponsored by the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative. The series, an adjunct to African American 146X, Afro-Amer 146X, explores the rich contributions of Black people to electronic dance music. We investigate how this genre, often associated with Black, queer, femme, and non-binary individuals, has underpinned communities and economies with discussions spanning cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and more. We're pleased to close out season 1 of the series at the storied Hip Hop Archive and Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research here at Harvard. Today's session, our 5th in the fall 2023 semester, is also our season 1 finale. We welcome DeForrest Brown Jr., author of Assembling a Black Counterculture, and a musician also known as Speaker Music, who will perform a live performance of the new LP Techxodus following this lecture. Brown has written the leading account of Detroit techno's history within the long stream of US history. The book has served as a lodestar for the course, and we are very thankful for his presence here today. And this is the book I have to show you guys. For our audience here and online via our YouTube live stream, we will have a Q&A session after the talk. Online attendees can use YouTube's chat to submit questions, while in-person attendees can raise their hand. Our fantastic organizing assistant, Ebony Smith, will provide a mic. Please keep questions brief for broader participation. A recording of this talk will be accessible on our YouTube page via this QR code. Our website hosting these talks is now live at bem.aas.fas.harvard.edu. Please visit to view our past 3 lectures and for other important announcements related to the study of electronic dance music here at Harvard. Using this QR code will allow you to join our mailing list to keep up with future updates. This has been an exciting season of talks, 5 talks this season, and I can already tell you that our class has been enriched by the intellectual generosity of our honored guests. We are tremendously thankful to our co-sponsors in the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, the Mahindra Humanities Center, the Department of Music, the Standing Committee on Theater, Dance, and Media, the Committee on Degrees and Social Studies, the Department of Anthropology, and the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies. I would also like to take this moment to thank each and every one of you who have attended our Season 1 of talks. The community we have built around this most novel of subjects at Harvard has been truly gratifying. To Afro Amber 146X, thank you for being intrepid scholars. Thank you for your enthusiasm in class and through your original research. And thank you for highlighting the importance of electronic dance music from the perspective of Black history. Your spirit has infused the first iteration of this course and research program, and future generations of students both within and without Harvard will undoubtedly benefit from your dedication. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Ebony Smith once more for being the most amazing organizing assistant ever. I must ask you all to please join me in giving her a warm applause for this. And I'd also like to thank Jeff, Paulman, Pat, and Omar, our amazing crew at Education Support Services, for holding us down for 5 episodes this season. Thank you again. So please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Thank you so much. Before we end Season 1, I'm pleased to announce that many of our students will soon publish essays based on their research on our website. Stay tuned for the release of a new section of our website entitled The Study. We will also release a playlist based off our semester of study. And to keep up with these and other future updates, just make sure to sign up on our mailing list at the website. Once again, bem.aas.fas.harvard.edu. Now, to introduce today's speaker, we aim to have a student in Afro Amber 146X introduce our esteemed guests. Today, Gustavo Borges, a Harvard Graduate School of Design student, will introduce DeForrest Brown Jr. Gustavo Borges, a Brazilian designer, visual communication technician, and multidisciplinary artist, passionately believes in the transformative potential of design for societal impact. Recognized in both 2020 and 2022 by Papel e Caneta as one of Brazil's 30 voices that fought to change the communication industry, Borges is dedicated to addressing the underrepresentation of Black and brown designers. His involvement as a founding member of Preta DG, the first Black and brown volunteer collective within ADG Brazil, otherwise known as the Graphic Designer Association, has initiated crucial conversations surrounding structural racism and the celebration of Black people's contributions in Brazil. An artist who explores various mediums, Borges introduced his alter ego, Ogu Ota, to DJing and electronic music production in 2021, creating captivating audiovisual experiences. Currently pursuing a master's degree in design studies for the public domain at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, his academic research focuses on dismantling ethnocentric bias by reclaiming the design contributions of marginalized communities. Beyond academia, Borges is actively engaged as co-president of Brazil GSD, a research assistant at Harvard Kennedy School's Bloomberg Center for Cities, and head of communication at the Harvard Brazilian Association of Students and Scholars, embodying a diverse journey that inspires the convergence of creativity and societal change. I've seen Borges' design ability, and he is tremendously talented. Please join me in warmly welcoming Borges to the stage.
Thank you, Professor. DeForrest Brown Jr. is Alabama-raised and identifies as an ex-American musician, rhythmanalyst, theorist, and writer. Creating music under his own name, as well as the moniker Speaker Music, Brown channels the African-American modernist tradition of rhythm, soul music, and has the intellectual side and soul of generational trauma. On Junetheenth, 2020, he released the album Black Nationalist Sonic Weaponry on the English electronic music record label Planet Mu. Brown's book Assembly, A Black Counterculture, published by Primary Information in 2021, followed. Both works explore topics like the Black American experience, industrialized labor system, and a Black innovation with electronic or techno music. Brown is also best known as the representative of the Make Techno Black Again campaign, and has appeared in Artforum, Canopy, NPR, CTM Festival, and Mixmag, among many other publications. He has presented his work at the Haus de Kulturen de Welt, Berlin, Camden Arts Centre, UK, Unsound Festival, Krakow, Sónar, Barcelona, Issue Project Room, New York, and many others. Please give it up for DeForrest Brown Jr.
Well, hello. Thank you for coming. This is a very special moment. I'm very happy to be here. It's, as a college dropout, as a person who, first, before I even get into this, I have to thank my mom and my dad, because without them and their taste in, this music, I wouldn't have known where to sow the seeds to even write this book. My mom's from Astoria, Queens, and grew up as as Queen Latifah, with the four-finger rings, and was rapping. And my dad's a Alabama, former baseball player that, taught me everything about Africa Bambaataa and electro. And it just, through them and through the years of being a music journalist, I was able to synthesize this together. And then, I'd also like to thank my partner, who put together these slides with me and really patiently was there with me through the writing of this book. And also one of my best friends is in the audience right now, which is really nice. So thank you all so much for this. But to jump right in, assembling a Black counterculture is a lot of things. In short, what I'll say it's a piece of technology. It's thinking about a book in ways that books maybe used to be thought about, as a way of kind of containing entire worlds of information and keeping it kind of nested in together, kind of I think about it like a bonsai tree, where you're sitting and kind of manicuring the different sides and making sure that the timelines are all succinct and fine. And so, okay, I'll start with the book cover here. This was done by Abu Kadim Haq, who for the last 33 years has created many of the covers of Detroit techno, music releases. And when I started working on this book, he was the first and only person I thought to reach out to about the cover. But this cover here is an explicit example of what it is I've been trying to tell people that techno is. It's a portal. This painting here takes place in the year 2100, and we obviously won't live long enough to see this time. But the entire point of the book and the point of this painting is to look forward, to look for something beyond us and to slowly create rhythms towards this eventuality. So, to quote another Alabama native who was a migrant to Detroit during the pre-Jim Crow Black Reconstruction era, he was a former cotton picker, sharecropper, and he left Alabama, moved up to Detroit to work at Chrysler, and James Bloggs, was working on the auto plant and was looking at the system, looking at how he was working on the assembly line, looking at the different managerial structures of the assembly lines, thinking about the sort of paternalistic ways in which people like Henry Ford were buying homes and cars and refrigerators for their employees and kind of creating entire towns around industry. And he was like, this looks a lot like the plantation economy. And he did a lot of really interesting writing and a lot of speeches that I think have been lost to history and lost particularly to the Black radical tradition. But I see him as being a forefather of techno, in a sense. So obviously, here we have in 1966, he gave a talk called The Negro and Cybernation, in which he, again, looked at the assembly line and thought about automation. He looked at the assembly line, looked at the way the cars are being put together, and he was like, oh, we can be replaced, just like we were replaced during the plantation economy. which, I mean, is what the Emancipation Proclamation actually was, which was it was a way to sort of divest from slavery, to economically cripple the South, and to have the industrialized northern states reign supreme, and then eventually take over the South and create this thing, this corporation that we call the United States of America. But this chart, to pair it with James Boggs, this chart comes from a 1997 compilation release by the duo Drexciya, which I'll get into their mythology a bit later, but this chart actually comes in the CD. There's a series of vinyl reissues that have come out in the last 10 years called Journey of the Deep Sea Dweller that compiled a lot of Drexciya tracks, unbeknownst and uncompensated to the surviving member Gerald Donald. But these vinyl reissues don't actually have any of the liner notes. It doesn't have any of the charts, any of the sort of artworks that would define what Drexciya is for us. So one of the first things I did when I started working on the book was pull out this chart. And, when I, show people back home at like my home church, and when I showed, my family, they were like, wow, this is us. This is us in 1655 when the Dutch East India Company started the first corporation after developing capitalism, after separating themselves from the Royal Imperial Catholic forces of antiquity to build this new thing we call America, New Amsterdam. We have this beginning of capitalism here, this beginning of industrialism, and then 1867, we have a sudden divestment from it. But also within this period of time, we have the Enlightenment era. We have philosophers paid for by the state. We have people like Immanuel Kant, this like sickly man who routinely would walk around in circles around the town and think all sorts of horrible thoughts about hierarchy and how to order the world economy and how to think about reason and how to buffer objects into existence out of our own minds. This lunacy we call modernity comes out of this period. And then there's a gap here between 1867 and 1930s. We'll get into that. But James Boggs was born right around here in the 1930s, and so were my grandparents. And they lived through the very violent Jim Crow era and the Black Reconstruction era. My great-grandfather was freed in 1930 and helped build my entire neighborhood. The neighborhood I grew up in was literally built by some of the first free Black slaves and Native people. And I think about that Afro-Indigenous sort of revolutionary politic and infrastructure anytime I'm thinking about techno, but we'll get into that a bit more. But the main thing I wanted to point out here was this economic crippling of the South, which caused, obviously, a migration north, which my family did. I have family in Chicago, Detroit, or had family in Chicago, large family in Detroit, family in New York. I mean, all Black people kind of have these sort of interlinked connections, but this migration is penultimate, because before the emancipation and before these migrations, 90% of Black people existed in the South. And then there was a whole obvious other swath of people that were in South America along the Caribbeans, and there was trade routes of slaves between those different poles, we'll call them. But in the 1930s and 40s, there was a slowdown in this sort of migrant activity, and there was a specific migration that was happening amongst Black people to get away from the Imperial Republic of the South, which we still see is alive today through people like Mitch McConnell. So, some years pass, and the next generation, the kids of these people who migrated, began to interact with machines. They began to interact with the assembly line. They began to interact with drum machines and studio equipment and things like that, and we'll get into the details of that later too. But essentially, in the year 1988, a British man named Neil Rushton went to Detroit, or actually it was around 1987, he went to Detroit looking for house music. And he was like, I know house music's coming from Chicago. In the 60s, he had exported quite a bit of Motown soul records into the UK and helping create the Northern Soul movement that would create the thing we call the Beatles. And he was like, maybe I can steal some more music from there. So he goes and he finds techno. And he puts together a compilation called The New Dance Sound of Detroit, Techno. with an exclamation point, and it comes out in 1988, and it's a commercial failure. But in that failure came a format, and that format was copied ad infinitum by particularly a club called the Hacienda, where we got bands like Joy Division, Oasis, Again, we'll get more into this. And this last part, the journey home, the future, is, under normal circumstances, I normally tell people that this is a secret, a black secret. But the point of this talk and the point of being in this archive is to share a little bit of that secret for those who know, as the Detroit techno producers say. So, when I first found out about techno, it was not through the club. I had these sort of memories of the idea of techno through Africa Mambata, through Nucleus's Jam On It, again through my mom, through various hip-hop artists. I had these ideas of black people working with machines, but it hadn't culminated into anything succinct. As, a little kid who was obsessed with computers and internet and Digimon and stuff like that, I was just like, what is this? I want to work with machines. And while in college, I found this book for 50 cents at the local library called The Third Wave. And it's a book by the futurist and businessman Alvin Toffler, who he's written a few books. This is actually a sequel to another book he had written called Future Shock, which is about human society, particularly Americans, not being very good with change, particularly technological change, and there being a shock from the sudden change. Actually, a good example of this would be in the year 1890, most Americans were small business owners. By the year 1900, most Americans were working 9-to-5s. And there's a change there that just, kind of happened. And we don't address it. And suddenly, we have refrigerators, and suddenly we have cars, and suddenly we have mortgages, and suddenly we have credit cards, and suddenly we have air conditioners and internet, and, and it just keeps going. It just keeps going. This debt, this necroeconomy keeps kind of emerging over time. And Toffler was writing about these movements from us being nomadic in the first wave, this sort of romantic idea of the hunter-gatherers eating mushrooms and suddenly gaining consciousness and, dancing with fig leaves and stuff. Then, you start developing society next to rivers, like the one right over there, and you start developing civilization off these rivers, extracting from Mother Earth and extracting from the people that are on Mother Earth to make this thing called civilization happen, to be civil. And that keeps, because that's not enough. We keep going, for about 800 years here, Europeans were held in castles, held captive, told that the sky was God and that they had to buy plots of land to get into heaven and all sorts of ridiculous things off of a book that was not written by Constantinople. And we can get into the fall of the Roman Empire another time. But this isn't enough, so they keep pushing. And it starts automating a little bit. You get some assistance from machines. You get the second wave of the industrial era, which is the thing that was happening in the 90s and why we have 9-to-5 jobs and air conditioners and all these things. This pushes on a little bit more to this now. But let's not get too comfortable, because that now took place in the year 1980, the year that Juan Atkins started developing techno. The information era coincides with the American economy being moved off the gold standard to this point where the economy was digital and superfluous. And all things, as Marx says, everything that is solid melts into air. And that is the entire point of capitalism, is to drain the life force out of physical things and to make it ephemeral, to make it... Yeah, there's not quite a word fluffy enough for it, but yeah, just to make it insoluble. And then we push up a little bit more from the third wave, because most of us grew up in this time. Then there's that fourth wave, that little dot there. I tell people that was 2020. That was when we had a choice between global consciousness, which, internet, which we're all in lockdown, pandemic, so global consciousness. And then we have overshoot and collapse. And but that line here, I often tell people, is the night of whatever talk I'm giving. And it is the hypothetical carrying capacity of spaceship Earth for the ecological load of humankind. So we're all teetering right on the edge of no longer global warming, but global boiling events in which, the air around us compresses and we go, all sorts of interesting extra physical things start happening because we've exerted too much energy from the planet. So yes, obviously I'm a tree hugger from Alabama. But let's get into what techno is. Techno, according to Juan Atkins, and one of the things I really like about him as a person is that he's a smart dude. He actually would sit down and think about things. He read that Toffler book while studying data processing and music at a local community college in Detroit. And, he was hanging out with a Vietnam vet named Rick Davis, and together they were working on machines, Juan with pawn shop machines that he had gotten, like a Korg MS-10, which is half of a Korg MS-20, so essentially like a practice instrument, and an 808 that he had picked up from a back room of a pawn shop from his grandmother, who was very proficient with the Hammond B3 organ, which is one of the first, or the first electronic device that Black people were to ever use, and was popularized in the Black church throughout the entire East Coast. But also, a lot of our classic rock uses that sound as well, of the Hammond organ, so interesting correlations there. But Rick Davis was a different beast. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was a decade older than 17-year-old Juan, and he had just come back from war. And, he had seen some things. He had seen his entire platoon just wiped out in an ambush in the jungles, and would tell Juan things like this. He was sitting around reading Dianetics, the Scientology Bible. He was reading Samuel Delaney and talking to this 17-year-old kid who was interested in data in the future about making electronic music. Together, they came up with a thing called techno, music that sounds like technology, but not technology that sounds like music. Meaning that they wanted to make a music that expressed the possibility of technology on sound. How far can sound be stretched by technology and the human feedback with technology? And not so much thinking about what buttons you press to make what sound and what sort of response you get, but having an actual reciprocal and very human and empathetic relationship with machines, which is one of the things necessary to keep the overshoot and collapse from happening. But Juan was also an interesting music business thinker, and that's something that's actually really important to think about here, is that when he and Rick Davis, as Cybertron, Cyborg Cyclotron, Sacramento, so even the name is a piece of technology that can be pulled together, and put together and pulled apart. When they were working together, they were working on an independent record label that they had started called Deep Space. Cybertron emerged from deep space as a metaphor, as a poetic pataphor, rather. So it's not like Cybertron emerged from space. It did emerge from space. And I would say a pataphor is similar to the Metamorphosis from Kafka, where the main character is vermin, so he becomes a bug. And that's the thing about techno, is that they were thinking about how to distribute records themselves at a time when that wasn't really possible. And ironically, after scoring a hit with one of their first tracks, Alleys of Your Mind, they got contacted by Fantasy Records, a record label out in, I believe it was San Francisco, California, a label that famously signed artists like Dave Brubeck and Sylvester, which I found very interesting. So a whole other genre of Black music, high energy, comes out of this label, and they knew exactly what they were doing when they signed Cybertron. And they sold 50,000 copies, made their million in 1981, called it a day, and they broke up and moved on. In the meantime, this term, house music, was slowly simmering in another city out of Detroit, over in Chicago. And again, one thing I find interesting about Juan is that he has very succinct definitions of things that you can find in the archives, and these things are said oftentimes before other artists are actually recorded saying them. There's always the kind of, actually I'll get into this in a second, about which song was the first techno song, but sticking to the script here, house is kind of like a house wine. There's no genre of music called house. House is just the collection of records in your archive. And it's the vibe of a room, particularly of the Warehouse Club or the Power Plant Club where Frankie Knuckles would play. And to give a little context about Frankie Knuckles, he was from New York, hanging out with his best friend Larry Levan, getting in trouble and being, the cool queer kids they were. And they would hang out in the Continental Baths where they met David Mancuso, who was an interesting man who liked to throw parties, art parties. And he had a friend named Robert Longo who developed some really nice, huge, artisanal speakers, and they together had this thing called The Loft, but also the Continental Baths. They later started Paradise Garage. And in that bathhouse situation, in these party situations, Larry Levan would take disco records, soul records from archives, things that he bought from other distributors who were around, and he would play these records and play them side by side. Larry Levan, would walk around the room, pushing the speakers around, making sure that, there was an actual physicality to his DJing, where he would play a Aretha Franklin song and just let it play, and then rip it off and drop this Italo disco track right underneath it, and would kind of do these things that hadn't really been done before in a live setting. And so that's garage music for the Paradise Garage, and the Brits came over, and they started buying ecstasy and records off the New Yorkers. The ecstasy had come from a cult, the Osho cult, down in Texas. That's a whole different story. But just know that the Osho cult is why the Europeans like ecstasy so much. And the Europeans took those two, or the Brits in particular, took the ecstasy pill, they took the house or the garage music, and they came up with UK garage. So there's no genre called garage. That's just a hauntological apparition in British people's minds. Just like the idea of blue-eyed soul, it's an apparition that's not real. Also like them being Roman. They're not. So Haus appears when Frankie Knuckles, who was an A&R for Billboard, so working for major record labels, getting promos, hot off the presses from record labels, he was asked to open up a club called the Warehouse in Chicago, moves down to Chicago, starts playing these promo records from New York, which is, kind of a big deal, big fish, small pond kind of thing. Not that Chicago's a small city, but, the music industry was not as robust as it was in New York. So he comes down playing all these rare disco tracks that you literally can't get. And that becomes the house music because he's the only person who had these records. And oftentimes, in the case of Future, the group who invented Acid House, he would have these other people's records, these independent artist records. He had Juan Atkins's records, he would play, and oftentimes he wouldn't tell people whose tracks they were, because it was magic for people. They were like, where's this music coming from? And he's like, yeah, I'm making it. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Have your juice, have your ecstasy. It's all good. And that's kind of what was happening. House music, in a sense, as an archive, absorbed the sort of isolatory techno music into the fold of Black consciousness and Black liberatory dancing. But there's another part of the story that gets left out. While Frankie Knuckles was in New York, the Detroiters were doing a thing called progressive music. So you have Motown Records, a multi-million-dollar Black independent business that was started in Motown in the 1950s, had developed the entire sound of young America. They had taken all these sort of Black soul sounds from the South and electrified it into something that we now call pop music, into the basic structures of singer-songwriter, actual structures, but also placing them inside the speakers in a certain way. There was a sort of early A&R work that was happening and an early kind of data analytics work that Berry Gordy was doing with people, where you would have, live sessions with the artist recording in front of an audience and being like, what do you guys think? And Frankie Knuckles would do a similar thing with the audience. We play a promo track and be like, hey, do you guys like that? And then report back. And yeah, you have this feedback of business to consumer relations. But progressive music emerges in the fallout of Motown. After Motown left Detroit in 1972, moved to LA, where they began to produce all those great records we know, What's Going On, and Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions, which was one of the earliest electronic records to come out on a major label at the time. And what progressive music is basically all these archives of music being left behind, turntables, records, and people like Ken Collier began to spin them and create a thing called progressive music. And I found out quite a bit about this when I was talking to Delano Smith for this interview a few years ago. And he filled in a lot of dots for me in regards to this particular space. He was there from 1981 to the year techno started with Cybertron's Alleys of Your Mind, and 1984, the year after Cybertron's Clear, but 1984 is the year where electro starts, and we'll get into that in a second. But in that period from 1973, so the year after Motown leaves, until 1984, there was a club scene, a sort of upscale, young, black middle-class club scene that had emerged that did not include Juan Atkins. Juan Atkins was not in the club scene. He was a nerd who was sitting in his room with his machines after having sat in his room with machines with a Vietnam veteran. And he had a, which, just to put that image in your head. So his friend, Eddie Fawkes, is like, come on out to the club. You have to see this. You got to see this stuff. Like, they're playing this crazy music just like you. And he's like, I'm sure they're not playing music like me, but let's go. He goes, and the thing is, Eddie Fawkes is like, bring your drum machine too. Whatever that thing is. Like, bring that thing. They'll love it. And he brings out his 808 in the middle of a DJ set because they're like DJ battling and stuff. And Juan starts banging out a beat. And literally everyone's like, what is that? And they're future shocked. And that particular thing is something I want everyone to remember about the difference between house and techno, is that the people playing progressive music and playing house music were shocked when they saw a drum machine because those things weren't on the market yet. The only people who had an 808 at that time was people like Marvin Gaye, which, if you remember him singing the NBA, I guess it was like All-Star Game, like national anthem, he had an 808 playing in the background, which at the time was unheard of. The only other person really working with the drum machine in a noticeable way at that time was Prince, who was working with the Lynn drum machine, which was a rival of the 808. So that's the key differences of these two club musics, of progressive music, house music, and then techno as an unfinished studio music. Which, okay. And one of the things I like to think about with black music is its slow progression and assemblage across the last 400 years. And the way that it gestures at something. You know, I think about like Ornette Coleman's like The Shape of Jazz to Come. There is a shape of black music to come, and ever coming and ever coming and ever coming in this agape love that just doesn't seem to finish. And the great Dr. Portia Maltzby has done the amazing work of putting together this chart, which helped explain so much for me that, you know, that my family have, you know, through an oral tradition I've tried to explain. But this chart and her scholarly work have been penultimate for me in terms of being able to get a picture of black music as opposed to a idea of black music. Because we want to move away from Kantian idealism into a realism, a black realism. So I love the way that Portia Maltzby talks about these movements where we're moving from the 60s and the 70s into this sort of soul music. You have this idea of I'm black and I'm proud, and this goes global at the exact same time that the CIA was sending jazz musicians over to Europe in the Operation Longleash operation, which, you know, they used, the U.S. government essentially used to establish jazz as an American music on the global stage. There were all sorts of music festivals in Paris and in Switzerland and you know, and over in Finland, where jazz musicians were literally playing in festivals opposite of communist art fairs, like, and they were like literally kind of across the street having a culture war, similar to the DJs. But this history is not necessarily as known to Americans. But so you have that in the backdrop here, and then you have James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud in the soul era, and then it keeps going where, you know, Malcolm X dies and Martin Luther King dies, and, you know, things get a little dark. And and then black people get into a funk. We get into the Reaganomics kind of recession, and things just keep getting low. And alongside that was the coke-fueled highs of disco in New York. You know, the rich folks, they were partying off of Muzak. They were partying off of disco records, which were essentially leftover studio recordings that producers would use to make extra money. You know, they would have, like, I was actually reading an article or listening to a video today from West End Records about how one of the first ever instrumental tracks ever put on a vinyl happened because they just had it laying around. This is in 1973. They had an A side with vocals and then a B side with instrumentals, and they're like, oh, let's just sell both sides. And, you know, just use the old scraps. But I mention this because this is the beginning of the crisis that we're having right now in music, is this idea of music as scraps, as content, to fill space and to fill time. But main thing here is this is a great chart because it does something that I think is also penultimate for Black people, is that there's two types of Black American music. There is the sacred and the secular. So sacred being for God, being for the self reaching to God, and the secular being communications amongst people. And there are moments, like later on, where those things intersect. But out of these, you get things like the folk Negro spirituals from the Fisk Jubilee Singers. Over here in the secular tradition, you start getting syncopated dance music and ragtime. And it just kind of keeps going until right around here when Motown happens. But actually, let's jump back up here to rural blues. This is around when the first record label, Columbia Records, started collecting Robert Johnson's recordings and creating this thing we called the blues, which we'll get into that in a second, too, of what the blues is. But the blues, essentially, is an idea. It's a generic package of the ideas of a Black soul music. You know, thinking about W.B. Du Bois's concept of, you know, souls of Black folk, the anthropologists who made us, who named us, in a sense. This gets whittled down into the blues. And it gets sold in a system we call race records, you know, where there were segregated labels, segregated charts, and this was in effect all the way up until Juan Atkins was releasing music. His music was often on the Black charts and not on the major label charts, which is part of the way that techno kind of got snuck under the rug a bit. But right around here, urban blues is when things start getting interesting. You have the urban blues of Motown kind of emerging out of Chess Records, which was another multi-million-dollar record label that preceded Motown. And over here, you have Columbia Records again with Clive Davis, who worked with the Harvard Business School to study Motown and to graft the genre over to create rhythm and blues. And then the chart splits. And that's where you get your disco, that's where you get all your mainstream music. And over here, you have the civil rights freedom songs. You have all the sort of wholesome stuff happening in the Black communities that gets whittled into all of these sort of things. And right around here, this is where things get confusing, because house and techno are in the wrong order. Progressive music is not there because it's not essentially a new music. It's a collection of older musics that got lost to time because there weren't a lot of recordings of it because of the sort of like playback nature of it. Over here you have electro-funk, which is essentially techno, but we'll get into that in a second too. You have go-go, which is kind of a half a genre if you want to be honest, but like, you know, it was there for like 2 years. Sorry, DC folks. You had Quiet Storm, which also isn't really a genre, but it's an interesting radio format. And then it just kind of keeps going. You have that line down here. And right there, I call that Techxodus, the end of Black music in the industrialized sphere. And I want to try to create a music that is forever creating genres in the middle of its being made, and there is no recording it. You can record it, but there is no actual recording it. There is no capturing it. There is no selling it. There is only sharing. So this is a new chart that was made especially for this talk because I thought it would be really important to make a distinction between industrial, electronic, and dance music. So a dance music is a social music. It is a music that people, the folk, participate in, and there's a feedback. And this is oftentimes, you know, as it is in European history, goes unrecorded. The folk do not get history because they are the folk and not nobility. And industrialized music is this point where the folk sounds are archived for the first time when the people actually get a say, you know, which is why we live in this so-called great democracy, or this thing we used to call a democracy, right? And this all starts in 1901 with the Victor Talking Machine Company. This was kind of a funny situation because it follows after the invention of the phonograph in 1877. The Victor recording machine, or the Victor Talking Machine Company, was invented and started mostly to figure out what to do with the phonograph and how to capture all the sounds around. And the first things they started recording were jazz and blues. And so when I talk about innovation, I mean it in the literal sense of the word. Simply change. How does the industry of extraction and, you know, this pushing towards the overload of spaceship Earth, how are we contributing to this? How do we change this? And when I talk about innovation, I don't mean musicological changes, like small changes in music. When you think about piano with the log drum, I don't think about the way that sound is being filled in spaces compositionally. That's all within the recorded system. I'm talking about the realist imagination of music, like what is actually being put inside the phonograph, captured within the space of a vinyl, or a CD, an MP3, and how is this being distributed? How is it being limited? So the Victor talking machine under the logo His Master's Voice begins recorded music in 1901. 1909, the Fifth Jubilee Singers were the first black group to be involved in these recordings, to have a say in how their songs have been recorded. But what's also interesting about the Fifth Jubilee Singers was that decades before, in the late 1870s, I believe it was, they were a group of freed slaves that went to Fisk University and began to be the first black people to ever go on tour. And they followed the Underground Railroad route on their tour all the way up north and over to New York. And, I like to say that the American continent, Turtle Island, as we should call it, is a gun. Florida's a trigger, New York and Maine are like the barrel. You load the clip back in where Silicon Valley used to be in like California. And, and the Fifth Jubilee Singers shot themselves over into the UK, where they sang for Queen Victoria, made her cry. She had never felt such humanity in her entire bloodline. And so the Negro spiritual is born. The Negro spirit is born. Because we're not yet black in this period. We're still Negro. We're still transforming, both legally but also idealistically. We move into 1912 when W.C. Handy began to notate and record the blues. He started in the late 1890s working in groups and notating this thing that was called Southern Ragtime. And he began to notate these sort of oral and vernacular traditions that were happening across the banjos, across the South and across voice. So music for banjo and voice without notation, Western notation. He takes that and he notates it, which makes it valid. He begins to publish it. W.C. Handy also started one of the first black publishing companies to publish these texts. And in a book called The Blues, he established the blues and just so happened to go to the college where he's from, in Florence, Alabama. And there's a band there called the Pride of Dixie Marching Band that has grafted his entire style and shaped it in the image of one of the people he influenced, George Gershwin, which that's what Rhapsody in Blue is. There is no Rhapsody in Blue because how can you have Rhapsody when you're blue? Unless you have the Negro spirit. So, W.C. Handy's interesting because he would travel over from Florence to work. Well, he would go up and back and forth between New York and Alabama, but he began to be a music teacher at the Alabama Agricultural Mechanical University where my parents met. And there's an interesting little connection there where he had a friend in Birmingham, Alabama named John T. Fess Watley. The Fess stands for professor. Professor was a good friend of my grandfather, and I was nicknamed Professor after him. And T. Fess Watley was an interesting person because he was the first actual documented music educator. He built the first Negro Society dance orchestra. And this is preceding jazz. This is before we have this idea of arranged groups kind of emerging. Like it was happening, but this is like the thing that really kind of kickstarted it. And him and W.C. Handy and several other musicians worked together to create a workers' union for musicians, but also a trade route that we now call, or did call, the Chitlin Circuit. And he would send musicians, he would teach them at a young age, send them up to New York, up to Chicago, and they would perform in Duke Ellington's orchestras and Louis Armstrong's group. And they would, you would have these big names like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, but underneath them were all these Alabamians that were all being just because he was a disciplinarian, he would just whip them in the shape and send them on. They would come out improvising. They couldn't just read music. They couldn't just sight read music. They could expand on the music. And one of his star students, besides Fletcher Henderson, besides him, his star student was a man named Lee Sonny Ra, who is also from my neighborhood. And Sun Ra got his orchestra from the Negro Society Dance Orchestra. He went to the Alabama Agricultural Mechanical University, and there he studied under W.C. Handy. And after that, he had a vision at the university where he envisioned himself being visited by aliens from Saturn. And he was like, okay, I'm gonna get out of here. I don't need this. So he left. In the meantime, while he's off like avoiding fighting in World War II, you know, all these sort of things happen. The first record labels start emerging, and the music further gets captured into these different economic conglomerates, this industry. And then right around here, Sun Ra emerges again. Out of the blue, he's no longer Lee Sunny Ra, he's no longer Herman Sunny Blunt. He becomes Sun Ra, the god. And he emerges on his own record label, El Saturn. And at that time, it was actually really difficult to have a record label. But the thing is, he would record everything. He had a tape recorder for everything, lectures, talking, rehearsals, live shows, and he would just gather and release these things, paint the covers, and was distributing his own music, you know, at financial detriment, obviously, but he was there. And then, you know, Warner Brothers emerges, and then Motown pops up. This black multi-million-dollar conglomerate that was owning both the black folk music, but also the black industrial music and blurring the lines between the two. Sun Ra, still independent, working through, right around here, starts working with a guy, you know, with the founder or the creator of the Moog synthesizer. And he was working with him on a Moog prototype that actually was never released before the Moog was even on the market. So Sun Ra, technically on record, is one of the first, obviously black people, but first people to actually play and to inform the way electronic harmonies and melodies and things are formed. This would pop up again later on around 1978 when he would release a record called Disco 3000 and another record called Media Dreams in Italy, where he was working with some new prototype drum machines and synthesizers that were never released. So these two albums are the only documents of these electronic sounds. But in the meantime, Leroy Jones, or as we know him as Amiri Baraka, is living in New York, living in East Village, hanging out with the beatniks, hating the beatniks, hating everything about them, and growing particularly sour, both with the beatniks, but also the northern black expression that emerged out of the Harlem Renaissance. He was becoming disenchanted with the sort of, you know, basically he became a radical. He was just like looking at these like beatnik white kids, like, no, this is terrible. And was like, and the thing is, he was also working, like me, he was working in music archives. And he was digging through these jazz records, and what he noticed was on the back of them were long, thoughtful essays, philosophies, biographies, and he was like, oh my God, I didn't know this about us. You know, and this is in 1963, before the Black and I'm Proud movement had actually started. You know, we were starting this kind of false integration moment. This is one of like the 3 times they tried to integrate black people into America and like actually like miserably failed. But this particular time, he was like, you know what, I'm gonna figure this out. We're gonna be blues people. And he built off the, you know, the souls of black folks and turns us into blues people. And he takes these liner notes and builds an entire story of blackness and black music emerging. But in that, he also talks about these phonographs. He talks about the invention of the radio and how the radio and the record labels work together to distribute black and blue expression across America and across the globe. 1970, George Clinton emerges out of DC. Moves to Detroit, becomes a songwriter for Motown, takes inspiration from Jimi Hendrix, who should be on the list, but I mostly just collapsed Jimi Hendrix into Parliament Funkadelic because they took all of the sort of like sonographic and stereophonic sounds that Jimi Hendrix was coming up with, all the distortion, all the guitar stuff, which Jimi Hendrix had actually picked up from the Isley Brothers when he was a session musician with them. So Ron Isley is actually probably the person we should be talking about here, but anyway, that keeps going. And out of Parliament Funkadelic comes a P-Funk mythology. And that's when we go back to Sun Ra, we go all the way back here, and these things come together for the first time in industrialized music. Push it a step further, Patrick Adams is the guy sitting behind most of the songs we call disco. He's just some dude sitting in the studio, decided to start a company called PA System, and the PA System is essentially 34 bands that made hundreds of albums, and it's mostly just him and a few session people. And so he created underground disco, all those tracks that Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levan were playing. You go down a step further, down in Miami, Timmy Thomas was the first person to take instruments, electronic instruments, and to put them together into a one-man band. He recorded the song Why Can't We Live Together before Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. But what also came out of that was Drake paying him a lot of money for Hotline Bling. So he got a nice payout later in life. which is what this talk is really about, reparations. So, 1977, Mandre emerges in Detroit. He was doing a lot of songwriting, playing with The Who, playing with Frank Zappa, touring and things like that, and he made a thing he called Future Groove, which is basically like he was marketed as being funkier than Parliament Funkadelic, and it was all one-man band electronic group, and he also had like another band with his wife, and they would tour together and do these kind of like 1-2 band combos. And he was working with Roger Lynn on the Lynn drum machine that Prince used. He was the one who was putting the circuitry together for that drum machine to even work for a Prince to even get. And at the same time, his colleague, who maybe unbeknownst to him, Don Lewis, had created the Live Electronic Orchestra, which was a combination of the Hammond B3 organ and several different drum machines, particularly the Ace-Tone rhythm machine, which precedes the Roland 808, the 909, the 303, and all these other instruments because it was by the same person, Itakaru Kakahashi, who met Don Lewis in Anaheim, California. Don Lewis was a nuclear scientist. He made songs for Martin Luther King and some from Alabama, and actually went to college with my aunt in Tuskegee, Alabama, and was there during the Tuskegee experiment. But the thing about the Live Electronic Orchestra is with his skills in nuclear science, he was able to solder these instruments together, and Itakaru Kakahashi, the founder of Roland, was like, how did you do this? And he was like, oh, you just like do some circuit bending and do this. And so he hires him, and Don Lewis sits down with a few Japanese dudes in Japan, and they sit down and they go, with the drum, and they like put the sounds inside the drum machines. All these drum machines that we know to be the sound of hip hop, techno, house, all Don Lewis. And then with some assistance from Mandre. And then this actually gets really dark and interesting when the session musicians found out about Don Lewis. And I told you before that T-Fest Whatley had started a musicians union, for music workers to not be fired, to maintain their means of income. Well, that union, oh, wow, actually, what was that, 8 years later? Yeah, they come over here, and they sue Don Lewis. They sue him for everything, for being the first person to combine all of these instruments together, because they say, you're going to put a lot of musicians out of work. And he can't do the Live Electronic Orchestra anymore, and it's sitting in an archive in Anaheim, California to this day, and he died about a year ago, which is really interesting and unfortunate. But the thing that was supposed to protect the music workers gets flipped, as it often does, to hurt the music worker, who oftentimes is black. And then we skip over to 1981. Because of that tax, Juan Atkins could go to the pawn shop with his grandmother and buy an 808 before anybody even knew it was there, because the gear companies were going bankrupt. But they had another card up their sleeves. All the, Yamaha, the Akais, the Rolands. The card up their sleeve was to refer back to their good old friend Don Lewis. They were like, how did he put these machines together? And Itakaru Kakahashi, Dave Smith, and another dude whose name I can't remember got together and created a thing called MIDI, which is the circuitry that you use to have electronic instruments of different companies talk to each other, which in any other industry would be called a monopoly and would be busted up by the government immediately. But because that did not happen, the gear companies did not go bankrupt, and electronic music didn't just disappear. So that's where Cybertron comes in. They were an independent group using pawn shop equipment from a fallen industry to create music before a Frankie Knuckles knew what a drum machine was, before a Larry Heard could go to the store and buy it, before Afrika Bambaataa could use it. Afrika Bambaataa borrowed his during a studio session that I think he paid like $2 for. And A Number of Names is the other group that started Detroit techno. The thing about A Number of Names, for one, is there's a great interview with Juan Atkins where he talks about how if you look at the vinyl, you can actually see the dates of when the vinyl was pressed. And he often says, if you know anything about music, you know how to find out who started what. And he was like, go buy the vinyl, you'll find out. But the thing about A Number of Names is that, because these tracks came out the same year, but they don't know who was in this group. It was just a bunch of kids. And Electrifying Mojo, the radio host who inspired all of them, is the one who gave them the name A Number of Names. Unbeknownst to them, Juan Atkins was making music that Mojo was playing on his show, as in he was working for Mojo making those sounds. So when we talk about did Juan Atkins invent techno or not, It's how many ways did he invent it? So, and we can get into Larry Heard, Adonis, and, you know, his famous No Way Back track that was played by Frankie Knuckles. We can talk about, you know, Mysteries of Love, which Kanye sampled in the Fade video, or Fade song. We can talk about Africa Mambata and Nucleus, which I had to put there because my dad loved that stuff, and it's just, I wouldn't have been able to connect these dots if I didn't know about this obscure group called Nucleus that had like one real hit song Jam on it, and then would actually break off and create another acid house group called Dream to Science, because there were two married couples, but one married couple became Dream to Science, released a few tapes, and then later ended up writing songs for Aaliyah, and you know, things like that happen, and then people never find out. And then Future gets a broken 303 made by Don Lewis. They just start making sounds, and it makes a weird latency clipping sound that they make a genre out of. And Frankie Knuckles starts playing it out, doesn't tell people that it's theirs. Long story short, 1987 and 1988, two compilations came out. The House Sound of Chicago and the New Dance Sound of Detroit. On two different record labels, liner notes written by the same person. Unbeknownst to the house people, that compilation was sold to Europe and Britain, and they got house music. None of the house musicians knew that their music was being played in Europe. Techno, on the other hand, had a marketing plan. They were working with someone who was supposed to market them and show them off to the Europeans. And, you know, it just kind of faded. Actually, I was talking to my friend about this earlier. What really happened was in 1992 at the New Music Conference, Ice-T, whose archive we're sitting in right now, got into a big brawl that distracted from a conversation that Derek May, one of the innovators of techno, and Marshall Jefferson, one of the innovators of house, was having with Tony Wilson of the Hacienda about how he stole techno. So thanks to Ice-T, no one knew what happened to house or techno. And here, finally, we have compressed the audio from an interesting guy named Benny Glover, who was working on an assembly line at a CD pressing plant in North Carolina. He was basically the guy who took the CDs off the pressing plant and copied them. And he did it before Napster. He's how we got, if you're black, he's how we got the bootlegs in the 90s. And that's when the archive was completely robbed for the first time. So his master's voice has been compressed and freed. And the entire music industry has not been the same. So, I'll move quickly I'll move quickly with this. So the idea of techno is that it is a resistance music. Mike Banks, Jeff Mills, they were there during the 67 riots in Detroit. They were in their houses when tanks were being driven down the streets. They were in their houses when shops were being looted and police were shooting people in the streets. And they remembered that when they started making music. They remembered that when they went to Europe and did this in 1992.
Live and direct from Detroit. Come on, usher it up. Pump it up. Let's go. Yeah. Come on, move. Move. Step up. Let's go. Raise your hands. All hands in the air. Get 'em up.
Underground resistance stands for a movement, a revolution. Underground resistance is a label for a movement. It wants change by sonic revolution, and it's all underground, but by people listening to that, their minds have been expanded, and things will never be the same again. The music is universal music.
So I'm going to stop there really quick, and actually, maybe if I can have a second to show you this. Basically what they're doing here is, this is after MIDI was on the market, but they still didn't have it. So this is still an archaic form of making instruments talk to each other. They were live sampling, using a Euro rack. They had the Roland DX7 keyboard, which is famous from like Seal's albums. And it's a notoriously hard synthesizer to program. Turntables, drum machines, and the guy rapping is an interesting one. He actually went over to Europe, or after that tour, went back home to Detroit, and then moved to Alabama, became a preacher in Alabama, because what he saw with the Europeans was something demonic. And he was like, I'm going to turn my life to Christ, and I'm going to keep DJing. He's like, I'm going to go back over, and I'm going to heal these people with the power of Christ. And during COVID, we had a really long conversation. Me, him, his wife, his daughter, who also makes amazing music, Lyric Hood. And we talked about COVID, and we talked about how techno was about a black soul. It was a black soul music about this collapse. And yeah, and I found this actually, as you see, this was archived in the Berlin Archive of Youth Culture. And I found this zine that he made where he explicitly said, after going on tour and inventing rave culture, that rave is not techno. That is not what we were trying to do. They were trying to protest the police death of Malice Green, who was, a black man who was beaten to death with a metal light bulb or a metal flashlight by a police officer. They were not there to party. They were there to do Black Panther work. And the music was copied ad infinitum. Years later, while I was working at Accelerator, a now somewhat defunct, barely there American dance music magazine, I got this, kind of notification. I had to write a post about Theo Parrish, who's a wonderful, interesting Detroit techno, also DC, also Chicago musician, who asked the question, how do you dance when we still swing from trees? When we still are murdered in front of our loved ones, murdered while subdued and harmless? How do you dance when our very image as a people is used to manipulate sympathy for a system of belief that wants you and your children to be dead or in jail? You better learn to listen with your body. You better play with your heart. It was a preference before, now it's essential. Escapism has always been an adjective used to describe the dance. That's an outsider's view. Solidarity is what it really offers. And to be honest, I haven't been much of a raver since I saw what happened in 2020. I haven't been much of a raver since I've been watching the invasion of Gaza. I am not much of a raver. I'm more interested in political change. So, Make Techno Black Again emerged almost immediately out of that during the Trump years. It was a conversation between my partner and her business partner about, they were Berlin and Brooklyn ravers, and they were like, they found out that techno was black, and they were like, well, what could it have sounded like? And, they came up with these hats, and we sold the hats $32. Half the money went straight into donating to these wonderful groups in Detroit, specifically Underground Music Academy, which was started by Underground Resistance as a school for the next generation of Detroit musicians. And the rest of the money went towards making more hats. And then in the end, we dumped all the money into Underground Music Academy because that's what you do, especially when you've worked in the music industry and you've seen how intellectual properties are taken, including my own. So, actually, we'll skip this. This is basically how people are not paying for music, and that just recognize you're not buying music. But either way, according to Abu Kadim Haq, when we were working together, when I was talking to him about what to do with techno, about how to write this book, he said to me, techno is something of a higher dimensional soul technology that these artists access to reach their highest states of their soundcraft. This is a wonderful term, techno-vernacular creativity, that I've grabbed from the wonderful STEM researcher, Natreet Skatskins, to expand on the idea of techno and to think of it as a vernacular. Much like African-American vernacular English, it is a modification of the crude and digitally unstable English language, and in this case, the unstable idea of Eurocentric technology into something far more creative, far more malleable, far more expansive. Oh, and we can keep going into this. But essentially, the thing you need to know is that when Cybertron's first album, Enter, came out, they jumped into another dimension called the grid. And that's where I'm at, in an alt reality where sound can do things. It can change things in people, and it can put worlds inside of your minds and open things up in your mind and body to create possibility. much possibility like Drexciya, which a lot of these techno musicians often talk about these worlds that they're imagining inside of their tracks as visions. And they would, sit and imagine these worlds in the dark, in their basement, and then they play a track live. They just make it up, and the world would emerge at that point. And then they would say, okay, this track is about Dr. Blowfin, and slap a name on it. Or this track is about how, the Earth is spinning backwards and how that's going to create a sort of change in how hurricanes work and actually compress landmass. That's a project called Shifted Phases that was reissued this year. And that leads up to my album, Techxodus, which is exactly what it means, an exodus from techno into something more. And this is me working with the man himself, Cybertron, Juan Atkins, and it was really, really wonderful after all of this time, after like a decade, to actually sit with him and have this conversation, to write the liner notes for his new release, and to think about reimagining techno from his perspective. How he sat with an AWOL Vietnam veteran and thought about things like Vannevar Bush, the inventor of the modern computer, the person who sat on the atomic bomb project, who was actually a leading researcher at MIT here. He's the person who wrote the textbook on how to use technology and how America and Israel can work together to bomb the fuck out of a random group of people for no reason. He's the person who did this. And he worked together with Norbert Wiener, the person who came up with the term cybernetics. And the thing is, and they worked with another person, Ernest O. Lawrence, who invented the cyclotron. The cyclotron is the key ingredient to an atomic bomb. And together, this Vietnam veteran worked with Juan Atkins to imagine how else we could use this destructive technology. Maybe it can send us to an alternate dimension. Maybe we don't actually think about dropping a nuke on people the way the IDF has actually said out loud to the world. And out of this came an exhibition called Hope that was done in Bolzano, Italy, in collaboration with the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, where I put Hawk's paintings together into this exhibition. And I'll just skip ahead here so you can see it. And basically the idea of this was to put together first these images from the great Dr. Ronaldo Anderson and Damien Duffy, which lays out his ideas of Afrofuturism, metamodernism. We can have a whole conversation about what that is. And here, in chronological order, is the story or the myth science of techno, starting with Hawk and me working together. So the vision, him and me working together, he extracts the story of the book out of my body. I have the vision. We see Spaceship Earth 2.0. Drexciya emerges. The rebellions happen. Or slave rebellions happen. Techno emerges, underground resistance emerges, and it just goes around the room until the year 2100. These images and selections from the book that explain what's happening in these images. And then 4 hours of audio kind of play in the background to put you in this world, and for the first time to actually hear techno in its appropriate setting. And that's the talk. Yeah. So, yeah, that sounds good. So, as per how these things go, I'm going to play about 10 minutes of audio for you. This is just kind of the idea of Techxodus, which was made completely live several times. I basically would play several live shows on a tour and then etch them over each other, and both sometimes in the studio, sometimes actually while live. And actually, I don't know if this is distracting for the live stream, but if you want, you can come around and watch. Should I take this off, or with this? Okay. that. Okay. Ugh.
One more round of applause, please, for the inimitable DeForrest Brown Jr. Truly a tremendous close for season finale. Thank you so much for the wide range of your research and your passion and everything from biography to study and everything in between. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me in this space. Thanks for coming.
So, DeForrest, typically at the end of our lectures, we like to ask our guests a couple questions. May we ask you some questions?
Sure.
So if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand so that Ebony can reach you with the mic. I will start us off with the question. This question feels very Sankofa for me.
Yeah,
feel free to stand or sit or whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, in our very first lecture of the season one with Abdu Mongo Ali on Baltimore Club, I asked Abdu, is techno Southern? And I think, you know, it was a short and quippy question. And I think it's a question that can unfurl in so many different directions. And I wonder if you want to take an opportunity to kind of give your answer, because I see it throughout the talk.
Yeah, you know, okay, I'll give you a parable instead of an answer.
Love that.
So, basically, back in the University of North Alabama, I had a advisor named Daryl Brown, who was a wonderful teacher who taught me everything, like he was my advisor, and he taught me so much about space, time, and black history, black thought, black literature, and he brought the great Ishmael Reed to campus. And nobody showed up. And it was me and Ishmael Reed for an entire day. And I had no clue that he was like one of the greatest novelists of all time. And we were just like, he gave me a copy of Mumbo Jumbo, and we like talked all day. And in that book, he has a term called Jezgru, which is the idea of an audio virus that comes from a term that comes from James Weldon Johnson, the person who wrote the Negro National Anthem. And the term Jezgru means the music just grew from us. And in the story of Mumbo Jumbo, the Jezgru emerges from south and travels up north, and it gets all the Europeans dancing, and it gets them dancing and like all worked up, and you know, and civilization falls apart. So I won't say that it's Southern, but I'll say the great Ishmael Reed suggested it.
That's a great story. Do we have a question ready in the audience? Let's get that mic over.
DeForrest, thank you so much. This was phenomenal. I just had the time of my life listening to you. Yeah. At some points in your talk, you talked about, I know we're kind of gathered under the rubric of a black history of EDM, and there were some gestures to a black queer history of EDM. There was also some gestures to a black religious history of EDM. And I was curious, a two-part question. One is about Robert Hood, this person that goes to Europe and comes back and is like, I'm going into the Christian ministry. And I just have never heard of this person, and wondering if you know anything else about his biography. Was that like religious, was it a departure from European music scenes into religion, or was it a return? Is the first part of the question. The second is, you know, you answered your first question as a parable. You're thinking about Techxodus, and I can't not hear the term Exodus in that and think about the kind of identification between African America and the biblical theme and motif of an exodus from oppression into liberation or something like that. So I guess that's another question about the title of your talk, and also the idea of Techxodus. Is that a part of maybe what we might call a black religious history of EDM, or something else that you're gesturing to?
No, that's a great question. No, because I think about this a lot in general, just having grown up Southern Baptist and like actually seeing someone play rack synthesizers in a church and stuff, and like, you know, while like a pianist is like live playing in a choir. And then in the back of my church that I grew up in, there was like, you know, a sound dude who was like, him and his wife are like recording the live, like the actual sermons and the music and playing it over the radio. So the entire time I've grown up, I've imagined this like studio session being elevated out. And I mean, there's plenty of queer people in the church. And that's actually one of the things, a lot of, like, we think about someone like Robert Owens, who's from Fingers Inc. with Larry Heard. Larry Heard's gay. You know, you think about how, actually, Larry Heard was a Christian. He's a Christian. Robert Owens was singing in the church. Actually, this is a funny nugget, but Pastor T.L. Barnett, who made the song Father Stretch My Hands that Kanye sampled, was actually one of the choir directors for a lot of these house vocalists in the church. And he like had this children's choir, which Kanye sampled. And I say that to say that the religiosity of blackness, I think, is it's implicit, it's unconscious, it's overconscious, it's all of it. Like, it's just entire black churches migrated up north, not just individuals. And so there's this idea of togetherness and mythology and timelines and grand narratives, to grab a term from Derrida, like that exists in all of us. And I think someone like Robert Hood, who had gone through quite a lot, I mean, he had actually gotten like shot in the head while working in a record store. He had like really gone through a lot of stuff. And him making music was a part of getting that energy out. And so I would say it's definitely more of a return, but also a revelation at the same time. And that's something I think a lot about with techno, and this idea of Techxodus is like the whole like Moses in the burning bush kind of moment, or like David dancing out of his clothes, like out of joy for God, or, I also think about what God told the Israelites, when they went into the land of Canaan, which is destroy everyone. So, there's a lot of Sankofa returns that happen across human history that affect the present day. And yeah, no, that's a really great question. Thank you.
We have another question in the front of the audience.
Hi. First off, thank you for this amazing talk. Secondly, when you hear Afrofuturist music, like I personally love Afrofuturism in the form of music, like how you're talking about with techno. But when you hear voices like Erykah Badu and Andre 3000, even more recently, maybe like a Janelle Monáe or Earth Gang, who really have these Afrofuturist musical influences, where do you hear like the techno influences, where like Afrofuturist music kind of started? And when you hear the modern voices of Afrofuturist music, where do you think it's going, or where do you think, do you think it's upholding what original like techno Afrofuturist music intended to do?
This is another really good question that will be answered in the form of a parable. So for one, it's something I talk to Hawk and Juan about quite often, actually, is that their idea of Afrofuturism predates the actual essay Black to the Future, where the term came from. And it was interesting, the parable actually starts about a year ago. I met many of the architects of Afrofuturism at Carnegie Hall when they were doing an Afrofuturism festival. And I managed to interview and become good friends with Yatasha Womack, who wrote the book Afrofuturism, Ronaldo Anderson, who has come up with an idea of Afrofuturism 3.0, which is moving Black people into the cybercultural sphere and thinking about this next wave of change. And then there's like King Britt, who does the Blacktronica project, and he's been a champion of Afrofuturism forever. And, it's one of those things where the article's called Rebooting Afrofuturism, if you want to read the conversations. But I think I would always refer to them. I will never say where techno or Afrofuturism is going without consulting my elders first. And that's something that's just been really interesting to me, is having read, Yatasha's work, and then like literally being able to like call her and just sit on the phone. Or same thing with King Britt or Ronaldo. And I've read his academic works for as long as I've been like able to read academic works, so the last like decade. And it's amazing to me to be able to sit and like talk with these people. But where is Afrofuturism heading? If I could give a conjecture, I would say it's unsure. I would say everyone is very unsure about what the future means. I mean, the future was a marketing ploy created by the Enlightenment era, but also by market capitalism to predict future stocks. So where the future goes, I think Black people need to have a long, hard think about the last 400 years before we answer.
So we'll queue up with more questions. Please raise your hand for Ebony to find you. But one big part of the talk that really is also another recurrence for me, and I think for many, is this intersection between art making and sound making. And I wonder if you could just meditate a little bit more, just share a little bit more of one particular relationship that you've been able to form with Abu Kadim Haq, futurist artwork, cover of your book, now a major exhibition. What's it been like kind of finding this relationship between the sound and the visuals?
I actually can't believe I know these people. Like it's still like really kind of wild to me. No, because with Abu, he was one of the first people I saw when I looked into techno. Like I saw the art. I didn't even see the producers' faces. I saw his art and was like, okay, what is this? You know, what's going on? I looked into him. He had just done a few interviews online at the time, and so honestly, I just like literally messaged him on Facebook. Like I just typed in his name, he was there, and I was like, hey, look, I'm working on this book, I love your art, can you do the cover? He was totally game. And the way I look at it, as a rhythm analyst, I'm kind of acting as a bit of a psychoanalyst for a lot of the producers. In this sense, and I don't mean that in like a derogatory way, I mean in the sense where I'm actually sitting with them, and for the first time, I think in a lot of their careers, just being like, what did you mean? And I had a funny moment with Juan Atkins, actually, where I was like, you know, what is a Cybertron? I was like, it seems like a piece of technology and not like a band. It seems like something really just like abstract expressionist. And he was like, if you do the research, you'll find the same answer. And I was like, whoa. And a lot of that is just sitting with these people who are literally like my parents. Like people like DJ Stingray look like my dad. And it's a thing where it's just sitting with them and listening, like actually just listening and not sticking them in front of a turntable and saying, make a room dance. It's actually sitting down and being like, DJ Stingray, what did you mean when you released an album called Fuck the New World Order in 2010 and then left America and moved to Berlin? What does that mean? Why would you do this? You know, and he goes, oh, don't worry about that. You know, I'm living in Eastern Europe now. And it's, you know, and I think about these ideas of, I mean, so much of it is that as a musician, because I was a journalist first, that was my bread and butter, was being, well, actually, no, you can't bread or butter anything from music journalism, because it's gone. But the thing is, it was just, I don't know, just getting, I don't know, it's just, I knew that when I started making music, I would have to go through the literal same thing as them. You know, and when I got attacked in Dusseldorf at the airport by a German woman who was like, get out of my country, Black American. I was like, okay, I know that this happened to Hawk. I know that, you know, when underground resistance went through, you know, the security at the airports in Europe, they would take apart their gear and they would like, you know, I understood that there were these things, and I would not have known what to do as a musician if I hadn't read their work. I would literally just be in Germany like, I don't know what's going on. And no, and I honestly, yeah, I owe so much to their vision that like I can't even like, that's why I call it Techxodus, is because I'm literally not even trying to bite them. I'm just like, thank you for everything, let me keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like a sort of spiral, but then when you think about the symbology of Senkovo, it also escape. There's a sort of escape. It doesn't just repeat.
Yeah,
so it's interesting to hear that in your journey. But I think many people in the talk were really affected by the portion on modernity and the portion on techno as a sort of, you said, a black soul music about collapse.
Yeah,
which is an interesting definition, and particularly the Theo Parrish quote on escapism versus solidarity. You know, in our classroom, we're constantly wrestling with this notion, the popular notion that techno is just repetitive, that it has no variation in its tempi, that it's not very even narratively based, that it's purely an instrument for escape. But why do we not see the sort of elements of it as a genre that allows us to build solidarity between each other?
I mean, it's not to be like people were dancing too hard, but that's part of it. People were definitely dancing too hard during Reaganomics and the AIDS crisis and the crack epidemic and, you know, and Desert Storm, Desert Shield and things like that. Like people were, because actually there's entire techno musicians like Blake Baxter who missed the entire house techno movement because he was like deployed. There's entire, or no, that was Kenny Larkin, yeah, who were like literally deployed in like Desert Storm, Desert Shield. They came back and they were like, "Oh, y'all dancing? Cool!" Like, and the thing is, I raved, I danced, I partied for years. I would actually go to like mega clubs. I would write about them. I would do that. But you know, as things reached a fever pitch with the Black Lives Matter movements, the several waves of movements that happened across the decade, you know, I thought about things that my grandfather had said to me, and he was, my grandfather was a fun dude. Like he had his fun. He was at the Summer Soul Festival. He did all the jazz stuff. You know, he's where I get this experimental side from. But, you know, he never, ever let me forget that he fought for that, that there was a real struggle for that. And it's, I don't know, it's something, I'll just refer back to David in the Bible. King David dancing out of his clothes for God. But, you know, you don't have to do it for God. You can do it for yourself, and you can do it for God. There's a great Drexia line where they say, like, God does not exist. He's virtual reality, and you can sit with that. They haven't explained it to me yet, but yeah.
We have a question in the front here.
Hi, my name is Beandria. I'm in the class with George, and my question is about your wonderful book, Assembling a Black Counterculture, which you know was one of our texts this semester. And just watching you do some of your music, it made me think, I wonder how that has impacted you as a writer, like your music practice, and how you wrote this book or other things in terms of like your process as a writer, particularly in that work, because it feels very much like you know, an opus. It has an opus feel to it, of like, this has been being written in the back of my mind for decades, and now I'm putting it into this book form to share with other people outside of my head, which we're very grateful for. But yeah, if you could just talk a little about your process and if there's any overlap with how you make your music.
Well, for one, you just like totally read me for filth. Thank you. No, it's one of those things when the book. No, it's just like when I finally finished the book, my parents were like, "Oh, you did it, finally," and I was like, "Oh, yeah, good, thanks." But no, it's no, they're very proud, and it's been a nice moment. They're watching right now, but it's yeah, which means everything, and it's that. I mean, it literally means everything. But no, I mean, the thing is, my dad taught me trumpet, like, and I learned in that same school system that Sónar came from, and I played trumpet and tuba, like, you know, my entire life. I played all the way through college, and it was a thing where the music was always there. But I took a sideline to do journalism because I wanted to think about the music after having done all the years of sight reading and improvising and all that stuff. And the overlap, I think, is, and especially when it comes to what a techno is the thinking about the music and like thinking about these next steps. And yeah, because I keep mentioning DJ Stingray because he's like a funny person to me in a good way because he was like a record shop dude. So he knew where the records were coming from. Same thing with King Brit. They were working in record shops and they were like, they understood the actual distribution. So this goes back to your last question, why don't we know the backstory? It's because we weren't in the archives. We literally weren't cruising for Utopia in the archives. We weren't there. Or I was there, and that's my problem. That's why I know this, because I was in the archives. And it's, yeah, I mean, I think that overlap, I try to make it really explicit. I try to be explicit about the fact that I should not be a professional musician, that there should be a professional music writing career that exists, that should exist, you know, but it's, when you see things like the founder of Rolling Stone saying things like women and black people contributed nothing to rock music, that's where the jobs went. That's where the overlap happens from getting laid off so many times at these various companies with like bad ideas about how to, I mean, just today, Spotify laid off 17% of their staff after making their profit for the first time in the entirety of its existence, which also the money from Spotify goes straight to the IDF, but that's beside the point. You know, it's one of those things where it just, I don't say everyone do this, but I try to make it explicit because I've seen too much, man. But no, thanks for your question. Thank you for being here. Are there more questions, or?
Yeah, just one more as we come to the very end of our live stream. Again, you are our final speaker. You are the capstone of this season 1. And I can't help but think about Techxodus as we approach season 2. As an explorer, sometimes it feels like a map that you don't completely see, but like you have a feeling of where things are. Where would you say is the sort of next place to go with our study?
Oh, yeah, after that, yeah. It's kind of ironic, but back. like back, actually, I saw a really interesting thread on Twitter about a few months ago about lo-fi hip hop, and it was a bunch of black kids being like, where did this come from? And they were talking about, what's his name, Fat John, who was like the first credited person doing lo-fi hip hop. And then you also had like Ninja Beats, who's this Japanese dude who was, and they were all making the music for that show, Samurai Champloo. But I put my money on King Brit's Adventures in Lo-Fi. He doesn't agree, but I'm going to throw him in there. And there's an interesting gap in the year, from the year 2000 on, where Americans suddenly got all this music that the rest of the diaspora was actually able to bathe in. Like South Africa actually got Larry Heard and heard it on the radio. In Britain, they actually got to hear Derek May and Juan Atkins and all these people on the radio, you know, and get to see them live. But Black Americans never actually got to see that. We never got to see the underground resistance performance. You know, instead we got all that cool stuff, like, you know, like Janet Jackson doing Rhythm Nation. We got New Jack Swing. We got, you know, 3-6 Mafia. Like, I'm just gonna keep throwing out amazing people. But it just, I think it's just looking back, because admittedly I don't have a lot of hope for the music industry. I don't have a lot of hope for the archive of music. I don't have a lot of hope for people having a different relationship with music other than as a social music that they drape on while studying or while dancing or while cooking. I don't have a hope that people will develop a deeper relationship with this literal like phenomenon of God that we can like express from our bodies. But that's where we go, right? It's into this place of music education, into this place of thinking about not so much where things went wrong, but where things started to go right, where we suddenly got, you know, we get like a Flying Lotus, we get a Jay Lin, we get, you know, all these like footwork artists coming out of Chicago. We have like Milwaukee rap happening right now. There's like, I think I heard a new term, Mecca, from a bunch of kids on SoundCloud that's happened. Like, there's all these things happening. It's just reattuning how we think about genres and where these musics come from. And it seems like right now it's TikTok.
Good luck to us in archiving that.
Okay, I'll be real. I can't remember her name right now, but there was the young lady who was like, ice cream's so good. I was expecting her to put out the most interesting minimalist, like hip hop where she's like, you know, ice cream's so good, yum, woo. And I was like, oh, this like vocal doo-wop music didn't come. And I was like, oh no, what are we gonna do? She made a regular trap song. You know, and you see like Ice Spice and you're like, oh no. And now Lil Yachty's like, yeah, no, I love Ice Spice, but you know. But it's one of those things like you have Lil Yachty literally being like, oh my God, hip hop is ruined. I had nothing to do with that, but hip hop is ruined. I'm listening to Dark Side of the Moon and like it's, I mean, the only thing I can think to do is to be like an algorithm, to be like artificial intelligence. Well, I'll say, instead of artificial intelligence, to not be like silicon intelligence and to be like carbon intelligence, and to think about the entire archive of music in real time, to think about these instruments in a different way. Like, literally just in a different way. Because one of the things I found interesting about groups like Drexciya is that they didn't listen to the radio. They didn't buy albums. They just made their music, and that was their therapy. That was how they dealt with what was happening in Detroit and in the world. And yeah, I don't know if it takes everyone developing a music practice. I mean, the program I use on my iPad, that you can have that on your phone. Sometimes I just sit on my phone and bang out beats, like on the, you know, when I'm just sitting around. Like my mixer, when I'm at home, I hook this up to my record player. This is hooked up to my stereo, and so I can play music from the records. I'm live mixing, recording, sampling in real time, and just, you know, and just living my life. But I think integrating music into the life is the next step. That didn't answer your question in like an industrialized way, but maybe like in a spiritual way.
The only way, the best way. Please join me in resoundingly giving DeForrest Brown Jr. a warm round of applause. Thank you so much, DeForrest Brown Jr. Thank you to everyone on our live stream for joining us for these past 5 talks. And we'll see you in season 2. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Yeah.